My name is Ana Delgado, and I was 33 when I found out that being the one who kept things running meant I was the one who could be replaced. I was 33 when I learned that a year of invisible work could be undone by a single sentence spoken into a phone, while I stood in a hotel lobby holding a binder of receipts I'd printed myself. The binder had 347 pages in it. I knew that because I had counted them twice before I left my apartment that morning. I had counted them because counting was something I could control. I grew up in a house where control was a word other people used. My parents called it responsibility. Visual. Kitchen table with a stack of bills and a wooden letter holder. A child's hand reaching for a pencil to write amounts in a notebook. When I was 11 years old, my mother sat me down at the kitchen table and slid a green ledger across the formica. She told me I would be handling the household accounts from now on, because my father had started mixing up the due dates. I was good at math, she said, so I would understand. At 11, I understood that the power bill was $142, and that if I didn't write the check on the right Friday, the lights would go off. I understood that my older brother, Carlos, who was 15, had never been asked to hold a pen over a due date. Carlos was in the other room, playing video games. That was my first lesson. Understanding is the burden you give to the child who won't complain. When I was 16, I worked a summer job at a dry cleaner's folding shirts for $6.25 an hour. I saved $482 over 3 months. I wanted to buy a used car so I could drive myself to school instead of taking 2 buses. My mother took the money from my sock drawer and paid the property tax on the house. She said we were all in this together. She said, family comes before savings. She said I would understand when I was older. That was my second lesson. The money I earned was family money, but the things that were family property were not mine. Visual. An empty sock drawer with a folded bank envelope on top. Inside it a handwritten note that says taxes. I was 33 when I started keeping the books for the Delgado Family Foundation. That was not its legal name. The foundation was called the Rojas Educational Trust, and it had been created by my maternal grandfather in 1997. My grandfather had owned a chain of laundromats across 3 counties. He was not a rich man by any standard that would impress anyone in the circles my parents wanted to impress, but he had been careful. He had been systematic. He had established the trust with $37,000 and a set of instructions that my mother had read aloud at his funeral, and then promptly ignored. By the time I was 33, the trust had grown to $218,000. I grew it. My mother and father thought the money was coming from dividends and responsible investments made by their financial advisor, a man named Arthur, who wore bow ties and charged a 1.3% management fee. I was the one who reviewed Arthur's quarterly statements. I was the one who noticed that he had been shifting the portfolio into high-fee mutual funds that served his commission structure better than our returns. I was the one who quietly moved 40% of the trust into a low-cost index fund and redirected the annual distributions to pay the property insurance on my parents' house, the car payments on my mother's Lexus, and the tuition for my youngest nephew's private school. I did all of this without ever being named as a trustee. I did it as an authorized signatory, a designation I had obtained by driving to the bank with my mother's power of attorney and asking the right questions in the right tone of voice. My mother had signed the power of attorney during a period when she was convinced she had a rare neurological condition that turned out to be a reaction to a new allergy medication. She had forgotten she signed it. I never reminded her. For 12 years, I ran the machine. 12 years of reviewing statements, filing taxes, renewing insurance policies, paying property lines, and making sure the family's paperwork never caught fire in a way anyone would notice. My mother called me the family secretary. My father called me his right hand. They. My brother Carlos called me the bean counter and laughed. I was the bean counter. I was the secretary. I was the one who made sure the lights stayed on. Visual: a filing cabinet drawer labeled trust documents. Inside it, a binder with a handwritten label, Rojas Trust, Master. The mechanism was a clause. Every trust has clauses. Most of them are so boring they could put a trained accountant to sleep. This one was buried in the original 1997 documentation, a paragraph so dense with legal language that even Arthur the financial advisor had missed it during his annual compliance review. I found it in the third year of my stewardship, when I was going through the original trust documents to verify a distribution cap. The clause said that any amendment to the trust's distribution schedule required the unanimous written consent of all living beneficiaries. The beneficiaries were my mother, my father, Carlos, and me. There was a fifth beneficiary, a cousin in Florida I had never met. But the clause included a provision: if a beneficiary was determined to have engaged in fraud against the trust, their consent was no longer required, and their share became forfeit. The fraud had to be material. It had to involve a misrepresentation of more than 10% of the trust's assets. I read that clause 3 times. I made a copy. I put it in my binder, and I did not mention it to anyone. Because at that point I didn't think I would ever need it. I thought if I just kept working, kept being useful, kept the machine running, my family would eventually see that I was not just the secretary. I was the architect. The annual gala was my mother's event. She had been planning it for 8 months. It was called the Rojas Family Legacy Dinner, and it was held every year at the Peninsula Hotel in a ballroom that cost $14,000 to rent for the evening. My mother invited everyone who mattered in her social circle: the spouses of the city council members, the executive directors of the local nonprofits she sat on boards of, the owners of the real estate firms she wanted to impress. Visual: an ornate hotel ballroom, a long table with place cards arranged in gold holders. Champagne flutes lined up on a white linen tablecloth. On assuming, on reality scene, I couldn't budget comes. My job at the gala was to manage the registration table and make sure the silent auction items were displayed correctly. I had procured most of the auction items myself: a weekend at a vineyard in Napa, a private chef's dinner for 12, a set of courtside basketball tickets donated by a client of my father's law firm. I had cataloged every donation. I had printed the bid sheets. I had labeled the display cards in my neatest handwriting, the handwriting I had been using since I was 11, and my mother needed someone to write checks. The gala was in its third hour when my mother found me at the registration table. She was wearing a navy blue silk dress and her pearls. She was wearing the face she wore when she was about to make a request she knew I would not want to honor. "Anna," she said, "the Caldwells are here." The Caldwells were a family that owned a regional grocery chain. They had been the target of my mother's social ambition for 6 years. Their oldest son had married a European heiress. Their youngest daughter was a television producer. They had money that made my father's law firm look like a corner store. My mother had been trying to secure a seat at their table for longer than I had been running the trust. I need you to sit at the overflow table, my mother said. She was not asking. The Caldwells brought their financial advisor and his wife, and were 2 seats short in the main room. I need you to move to the back. I looked at the seating chart I had created. I had spent 47 hours on that seating chart, cross-referencing dietary restrictions, conversational dynamics, and proximity to the wine service. I knew exactly who should sit where and why. The overflow table is fine, I said. I'll bring my plate back. My mother shook her head. No, dear. I need you to stay there for the whole dinner. The Caldwell's financial advisor is a very important man, and he's sitting with the donors. You'll be doing us a favor. She put her hand on my arm. Now, hey, you always understand. That was the first time I heard the phrase that would become the spine of everything that followed. You always understand. It was delivered with a smile and a squeeze. It was delivered the way you tell a child to stay in the car while you run into the store. It was not a compliment. It was a lock. I carried my plate to the overflow table, which was in an anteroom adjacent to the main ballroom, separated by a wall of glass panels and a set of heavy curtains. I could see the main table through the gap in the curtains. I could see my mother laughing at something the elder Caldwell said. I could see Carlos, who had no job and no responsibilities, seated 4 places to the left of the head table, drinking a glass of wine that cost more than my weekly grocery budget. I could see my father raising a toast, and I could hear, through the gap in the curtains, my mother leaning over to whisper to the Caldwell's financial advisor. The trust is very healthy, she said. My husband and I have overseen its growth personally for years. I set down my fork. Visual. A white linen napkin on a table. A fork placed across it. The gap in the heavy curtains, revealing a glimpse of a chandelier-lit ballroom. That was not true. My mother had not reviewed a single statement in 3 years. The last time she had logged into the Trust's online portal, she had been unable to remember the password, and I had reset it for her. She had not opened a single envelope from the bank in 18 months. I sat at the overflow table, and I watched my mother claim credit for work I had done. I watched her describe the portfolio as conservative, but growth-oriented, which was a phrase I had used in my quarterly update emails. I watched her gesture toward the man who was clearly the financial advisor and say that Arthur had been instrumental. Arthur was 3 tables away, eating a piece of salmon and nodding at someone else's story. He had no idea what she was saying. Do. When the dinner ended, I helped the catering staff break down the registration table. I collected the bid sheets from the silent auction. I counted the checks that had been placed in the donation envelopes. I did all of this because it was what I always did. I did it because if I didn't do it, no one else would. The day after the gala, I received an email from the Trust's bank. It was a standard notification. A change had been requested to the distribution schedule. The request had come from my father. He wanted to release an additional $50,000 from the trust to cover what he described as extraordinary expenses related to the annual gala. The request was marked urgent. The request had been approved by the primary trustee, which was my mother. I had not been consulted. I was the authorized signatory. I was the person who balanced the accounts. I was the person who had to explain to the IRS why a private foundation was expensing a $14,000 hotel ballroom and a $3,000 wine tap. But I had not been consulted. Nay. That was the second time I heard the phrase. I called my father. I told him the distribution would trigger a tax penalty if it wasn't documented properly. I told him we would need to restructure the withdrawal to stay compliant. I told him the trust was not a checking account. "Anna," he said. He was in his office. I could hear the leather of his chair creaking. "You always understand. We don't need the paperwork for a family expense. Just process it the way you usually do." I processed the request. I had to. If I didn't, the gala expenses would bounce. The caterer would call. The hotel would call. The embarrassment would be mine to bear because I was the one who understood. I processed it, and I moved $50,000 from the trust's principal into a checking account that my mother and father used like a wallet. 12 years. 12 years of watching the balance grow and shrink, of making decisions that should have been made by a committee, of absorbing the consequences of decisions that were made by people who didn't know what interest rates were. 12 years of being the secretary, the right hand, the bean counter. 12 years of hearing the phrase that meant I was useful, but not valued. "You always understand." Visual. A bank statement with a withdrawal highlighted in yellow, the number 50,000 circled in red pen. I started keeping a second ledger. The first ledger was the trust's formal accounting, the one I submitted to the IRS, and the bank and the financial advisor Arthur, who still believed he was the mastermind. The second ledger was private. I kept it in a password-protected spreadsheet on a laptop that I never connected to the family's shared server. I recorded every decision that was made without my input. I recorded every expense that was justified as family business, but was really just family spending. I recorded every time my mother or father used the phrase "you always understand" as a prelude to a request that treated my labor as infinite and my personhood as irrelevant. The second ledger had 214 entries by the time I finished it. 214 times I had been the silent partner in a machine that no one else could run. 214 times I had been the one who kept things from falling apart. The total value of the decisions I had made without credit, without consultation, without compensation was $218,000. That was the exact amount the trust had grown to under my stewardship. I had grown it by $218,000 from its original balance. My family had spent $218,000 on things they would not have been able to afford otherwise. And I had been repaid with a seat at the overflow table and a phrase that meant "do what we say, keep your mouth shut, be grateful for the crumbs." The day my mother asked me to move to the overflow table, I had already triggered the mechanism. I had triggered it 9 days before the gala, when I logged into the Trust's online portal at 1:47 in the morning and uploaded the documentation I had been assembling for 6 months. Visual. A laptop screen. A blue upload, complete confirmation. A thumb drive labeled backup. I had reviewed the clause about material fraud. I had matched it against the second ledger. I had copied the bank records, the distribution logs, the email requests that my father had sent from his firm's address, the justification forms I had been forced to fill out that mischaracterized expenses as administrative costs. I had compiled a 214-page packet, and I had forwarded it to the Trust's secondary executor, a professional fiduciary firm in the city that had been named as a backup in the original 1997 document. I had included a cover letter. The cover letter was 3 sentences long. I triggered the mechanism because I had finally understood that being the one who understands is not a privilege. It is a trap. Now, it is a trap that looks like respect, but functions like a leash. The secondary executor was required to investigate any allegation of material misrepresentation. They were required to notify all beneficiaries within 30 days. I had timed the upload so the notification would arrive 2 days after the gala, when the distribution for the event was already processing, but before it could be finalized. 9 days after the gala, the notification arrived. My mother called me first. She was crying. She never cried. She had never cried in front of me. Not when the property tax bill was overdue. Not when Carlos wrecked the family car. Not when my grandfather died. She was crying on the phone. Anna, what is this? There's a fiduciary firm calling me. They're saying there was a misrepresentation. They're saying there's an investigation. They're saying we might lose beneficiary status. I stood in my kitchen. I was holding a cup of coffee I had poured for myself. I had not been sitting down when the phone rang. I had been standing at the counter, looking at my own handwriting on a sticky note that said milk, Friday, visual, a kitchen counter, a coffee mug with a small crack in the handle. A green sticky note with the words, milk, Friday. I don't know what you're talking about, Mom, I said. That was not true. I knew exactly what she was talking about. I was not lying. I was declining to explain. Your father has been on the phone for an hour. They want to audit the last 3 years of distributions. They want to know why we allocated funds for personal expenses. They want to know why you signed off on things that weren't properly categorized. I took a sip of my coffee. I signed off on things because I was told to. I signed off on things because you both told me to process them the way I always process them. You always understand, Dad said. So I understood. She was silent. I could hear her breathing. I could hear the distant sound of my father's voice in the background, rising and falling with the cadence of a man who was not used to being questioned. Anna, this is serious. The fiduciary firm is talking about freezing the trust. They're talking about appointing an independent receiver. They're saying that if we can't justify the distributions, they might be considered misappropriation. She was using words she had heard on the phone. She was using words she did not understand, which was why she had always needed me to explain them. I had been explaining these words for 12 years. That was the point. The mechanism was not a secret weapon I had hidden. It was a consequence I had invited by doing my job too well. By leaving a trail of records. By documenting the requests I had been told to process without question. The gala was the context in which the phrase appeared for the 3rd time. 3 weeks after the dinner, my parents hosted a reception at their house for the Caldwells. It was a smaller affair, only 40 people. My mother had asked me to coordinate the catering, the flowers, the valet service. I had done all of it. I had done it because if I didn't, no one else would. The afternoon of the reception, my mother pulled me into the kitchen. She was wearing a cream-colored dress and her hair was pinned up. She looked like a woman who was about to achieve something she had been chasing for years. The Caldwells are bringing their daughter's fiancé, she said. He's an executive at a private equity firm. They're very important people. She put her hands on my shoulders. I need you to serve the champagne. I looked at her. Serve the champagne. I on the cocktail. And she'll be soon told. I'm the joy. You always understand, Anna. You're so good with the details. Carlos is going to be speaking with the fiancé about a potential investment opportunity, and I need you to make sure the glasses are full. Just keep your eyes on the trays. She said it in front of my father. She said it in front of the caterer. She said it in front of a florist who was arranging peonies in a crystal vase. She said it with a smile and a squeeze, and the assumption that I would comply, because I had always complied, because compliance was what I had been trained for since I was 11 years old, writing checks on a kitchen table. I served the champagne. I walked through the living room with a silver tray and a white cloth napkin folded over my forearm. I smiled at the Caldwells. I smiled at their daughter. I smiled at the private equity fiancé, who was wearing a suit that cost more than my monthly rent. I held the tray steady, and I listened to my mother describe the trust as a family legacy we have carefully preserved. I listened to Carlos explain that he was exploring new business ventures and would love to discuss opportunities for collaboration. I listened to my father joke about how hard it was to find good help. I was good help. I was the good help. I had been the good help for 12 years. At the end of the reception, I was in the kitchen, loading dirty glasses into a dishwasher when the private equity fiancé walked in. He was looking for a restroom. I pointed him down the hall. He paused. You're Ana Delgado? He asked. I said yes. He smiled. The fiduciary firm we work with has been talking about your trust. They flagged it as an interesting case. A beneficiary who documented everything and an executor who didn't read the fine print. I did not know how he knew that. I did not know why he was telling me. I did not ask. I just nodded and pointed again to the restroom. He nodded back and walked away. That was the moment I knew the mechanism had already fired. I had not told anyone outside the fiduciary firm, but the firm had told their network. The network had told the Caldwells, and the Caldwells had told their daughter's fiancé. I had served champagne to people who already knew that the trust was under investigation. I had served champagne to people who knew that the family presenting themselves as careful stewards of a legacy were actually beneficiaries who had spent $218,000 on things that were not approved. Visual: a silver tray on a kitchen counter, a smudge on the rim of a champagne glass, the reflection of a fluorescent light. You style when they hit the cap happening, but it happened to. The trust assets were frozen 3 weeks after that conversation. The fiduciary firm sent a formal notice to all beneficiaries. The notice was 6 pages long. It laid out the allegations of misrepresentation, the timeline of distributions, the records I had submitted. It requested a hearing. The hearing was scheduled for the last Friday of the month at 9 in the morning. The hearing was held in a conference room on the 32nd floor of a downtown office building. The conference room had a polished table and a view of the river. There were 8 people in the room: the fiduciary firm's representative, 2 trustees from the backup committee, my mother, my father, Carlos, a lawyer my parents had hired, and me. The lawyer started by attacking the documentation. He said it was incomplete. He said it was taken out of context. He said I had been acting without proper authority when I submitted the packet. The fiduciary firm's representative was a woman in a gray blazer. Her name was Sullivan. She had been the one who signed the notice. She opened her file. She pulled out a copy of the original trust document. Anna Delgado was an authorized signatory, Sullivan said. She had the authority to submit documentation. She also had the responsibility to flag irregularities. The records show she flagged them multiple times. She flagged them internally. She filed them in her own records. No one acted on her warning. My mother opened her mouth. My father grabbed her arm. She didn't warn us, my mother said. She just processed things. She always understood. That was the third use of the phrase. It was delivered in a conference room on the 32nd floor. It was delivered as a defense, as an excuse, as a way of saying I had never been a real participant, just a machine, just a tool, just someone who understood. Sullivan turned to me. And why Ms. Delgado, she said. What did you understand? I set down my pen. I had been taking notes on a yellow legal pad. The notes were unremarkable. I had written the date, the room number, the name of the lawyer. Now lawyer strike how to. I reached into my bag. I pulled out the binder. And you? You show. The binder with 347 pages. I set it on the table. I understood that I was being asked to process distributions that were not compliant with the Trust's charter, I said. I understood that the distributions were being made for personal expenses that had no basis in the Trust's stated purpose. I understood that I was the only person in my family who had read the charter. I understood that because I was told repeatedly that understanding was my job. You always understand, my mother said. So I did. I understood everything, and I documented all of it. I opened the binder. I slid it across the table. Sullivan took it. She flipped through the pages. She did not need to read them in detail. She had already read the digital copies. She was confirming that the physical copy matched. The lawyer for my parents started to speak. Sullivan held up a hand. Let me be clear, Sullivan said. The documentation is complete. The records show that Ms. Delgado was acting under direction from the primary beneficiaries. But she was also the only person who kept records. She was the only person who flagged the irregularities. She was the only person who complied with the charter's reporting requirements. She paused. There's a material misrepresentation of $218,000. That's more than 10% of the Trust's total asset. Under the clause in Section 12, Paragraph 4, the beneficiaries who authorize these expenditures are in violation. I now see. The room was still. My mother's face was pale. Nay, my father had his hand on the table. Then he was gripping the edge of it. Carlos was looking at his phone. Nay, he was looking at his phone because he was not part of this conversation. He had never been part of this conversation. Nay, Anthony, he had never opened a single envelope. The remedy, Sullivan said, is forfeiture of their beneficiary status. My mother gasped. She actually gasped. It was a sound I had never heard her make. It was a sound of something breaking. Anna, she said. She said my name like it was a weapon. Then gosh don't believe you won't. You can't. I looked at her. She was the woman who had sat me down at the kitchen table when I was 11 and handed me a green ledger and a checkbook. She was the woman who had taken my summer wages and called it family. She was the woman who had told me to move to the overflow table. You always understand, I said. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I did not deliver a monologue. I repeated the phrase because it was the only thing I had to say. It was the only thing that mattered. The hearing concluded. The fiduciary firm ruled in favor of forfeiture. My mother and father were removed as beneficiaries. The trust's remaining assets after the freeze was lifted were redistributed to the backup beneficiaries, me and my cousin in Florida. The cousin in Florida had not been aware the trust existed. She sent me an email 3 weeks later, asking what she had done to deserve a windfall. I told her she had done nothing. Oh, I told her she had been invisible. I told her that being invisible was sometimes the best thing you could be. The gala was canceled the following year. My mother could not afford to rent the ballroom. She could not afford to pay the caterer. She could not afford to impress the Caldwells, who had stopped returning her calls. I heard through a friend that my parents were considering selling the house. The property tax had been paid through the trust. The car payments had been processed through the trust. The tuition for Carlos's children had been covered by the trust's annual distributions. All of that was gone. The machine had stopped, and no one else knew how to start it. Visual, a house, a for sale sign in the front yard, and a car with a flat tire in the driveway. Now, Carlos called me. My son didn't yell at Jerry. He called me twice. The first time he asked if I could help with a cash flow issue. The second time, he asked if I had any ideas about how to get the trust reinstated. I did not answer the first call. I let the second call go to voicemail. I listened to the message and I deleted it. My mother called me 3 times. The first time, she left a message asking if we could talk about everything. The second time, she left a message saying she was willing to listen. The third time, she left a message saying she was sorry. I did not call her back. The apology was not for me. The apology was for the machine she had lost. She was sorry that the trust was gone. She was sorry that the money was gone. She was sorry that the gala was canceled. She was not sorry that she had taken my summer wages. I did. She was not sorry that she had moved me to the overflow table. She was not sorry that she had handed me the green ledger and called it understanding. My father did not call. He sent an email. The email was 2 sentences long. It said he had reviewed the documents and he respected my position. It was the coldest thing he had ever written to me. It was also the most honest. The cousin in Florida sent a check. She had received the first redistribution from the trust and she had decided to split it. She sent a check for $23,000 with a note. I don't know what you did, but thank you for making me a beneficiary. I cashed the check. I used it to make a down payment on a small house. The house was not a Delgado family property. It It had never been part of any trust. It was mine. It had a kitchen with a counter and a coffee mug that had a crack in the handle. It had a table in the dining room. Shumbi coffee. I had bought the table from a second-hand store. It was not a family heirloom. It was just a table. I sit at that table now. I look out the window. The window faces a small yard with a tree that was planted by the previous owner. I did not plant the tree. I did not inherit the tree. I am not obligated to the tree. I just look at it. I look at it, and I think about how being useful and being valued are two different things. I think about how the second ledger is closed. I think about how the phone is silent. Visual. A table in a small dining room. A coffee mug with a crack in the handle. A window looking out onto a yard with a single tree. The table has nothing else on it except a yellow legal pad. The legal pad is blank. There is a green sticky note on the counter. No. It says, "Milk, Friday, doll." I wrote it 2 days ago. It is not a reminder about a due date. It is not a note about a distribution. It is just a note about milk. The phone rings sometimes. It rings with calls from numbers I don't recognize. I don't answer them. I am not waiting for an apology. I am not waiting for a reconciliation. I am not waiting for my mother to understand what she did. I am not waiting for my father to acknowledge the 12 years I spent running a machine that he never learned to operate. I am not waiting for Carlos to stop looking at his phone. I am not waiting for anything. I am just sitting at my table. I am just looking at my tree. I am Ana Delgado. I am the 33. I have a house that is mine, a ledger that is closed, a phrase that has been returned to its owner, and a phone that I am free to ignore. You always understand. That was what she said. And I do. I understand that being the one who understands is not a punishment. It's a release. It is the thing that lets you walk away. It is the thing that lets you sit at a table you bought with your own check. It is the thing that lets you close the binder and never open it again. I understand that now.